basically just before Stonewall. During this time, as she talked about in the 50s and 60s, during during the Red Scare, which was also this time of anti-gay witch hunts, which are sometimes referred to as the Lavender Scare, police repression of gay people was intense, to put it lightly. At this time, during the Prohibition era, when everybody who wanted to go out and drink and party had to do so in secret, that's when sort of the gay bar scene started to flourish, because that's when, since everyone was doing these things in secret, it sort of gave this space to be opened up for queer people to come together. And by the 50s and 60s, gay bars had become, in some ways, centers for the mostly working class LGBTQ people. There were times when that wasn't the case, but by this time, that's how it sort of had evolved. And the police would regularly raid any LGBTQ space, especially in the bars. And this meant not just arrest, not just being beaten, but being exposed. Obviously, people who were gay at this time, or what we would now call transgender at this time, were, their lives were ruined if they were outed. They would lose their families, they would lose their friends, they would lose their jobs, and that, of course, could lead to losing housing and everything else that we require to live. It also meant, especially in the cases of those who were most non-conforming to gender roles, sexual violence. The police would often rape all of the lesbians, including butch lesbians. They would sexually assault or even rape drag queens and trans women as well. So these police raids were not just, it wasn't just a night in jail. It was much worse than that. And prior to Stonewall, there were rebellions. There were times when people fought back, one of the most famous being the Compton Cafeteria, which was in, I believe it was in San Francisco. But this was mostly black trans women and drag queens fighting back. And so there was this building resistance. People were with the context of the Mattachine Society and other groups that had started coming about at this time, there was a growing awareness of our political identity as a collective political identity. And there was, it sparked a greater and broader resistance. And so 50 years ago, as of June 28th, shortly after midnight, the police raided the Stonewall Inn on Christopher Street in New York City. And at first, it was, a typical raid. They started to drag everybody out. They started to arrest people. And for whatever reason, they started to fight back. It's said that Marsha P. Johnson was the one to throw the first brick through a police car window, and Stormy Largery, who was a butch black lesbian from New Orleans, threw the first punch. Others say that she fought her way back to the bar 3 times before they took her down. The fighting on the first night involved people, not just from the bar, who were mostly black and brown, working class LGBTQ people, but also people from the park across the street, homeless LGBTQ youth, who became involved. They threw everything they had at the police, from bricks and stones in the street to trash, to including someone with a Molotov cocktail. And the fighting got so intense that the police had to barricade themselves in the bar that they had come to raid. At the time, they also, just like the fucking cowards they are, took a hostage. That first night, word got out. Word started to spread, and by the second night, more people had come in. The fighting went on for 3 nights, with a break in between the second and third night that included, at some point, the members of the New York Mattachine Society putting up a poster begging for peace. So you could see how they had lost their radical spirit at that point. But other groups in the city joined in, including other queer and trans people from around the city, people in other movements, from the anti-war movement to the civil rights movement, people who had been involved in the community came to join in, and including other communists in the city. So the aftermath of this, which was a victory, this was not just they fought back and then they all got beaten and taken to jail. They fought back, and many of them actually managed, they didn't get taken to jail. They survived this fight, and they were inspired, and this inspiration spread much further than just New York City. Within a week, the Gay Liberation Front was formed in New York, and this group took their name from the National Liberation Front, which was the forces in Vietnam fighting against U.S. aggression. They also started, shortly after Stonewall, a group called Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries, or STAR, which was started by Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera, both of whom were at Stonewall. And many, many other groups began to crop up around the country that took on this militant spirit, this understanding that it wasn't just about private study groups or just raising awareness, but actually fighting back, actually taking it to the streets. And this was the roots of what today we often call pride. At the time, there were many, many, many other political movements going on. The anti-war movement was huge at the time. Civil rights movement, MLK had died just the previous year, but there was still an enormous civil rights movement going on, and black liberation struggles going on, and working class struggles around the world were much bigger and much stronger at this point. And so this was the context that the fight back at Stonewall took place in. This was part of what inspired the people there to fight back and get organized, is that they had seen it happen over and over again with all these other groups, and they had seen previously what had happened with the Mattachine Society and other groups as they either dissolved or became less militant and less radical. And so Stonewall was a starting point, in a way, a turning point. It was when, I like to think of it as when the LGBTQ political movement really came out. It's when our political identity could no longer be denied. And what came from there as a celebration and recognition of the events at Stonewall every year following were a continued buildup of these political events. And that is where Pride came from, or what became known as Pride. It had different names, different places, and different groups took it up. But throughout the 70s, the fight back against LGBTQ oppression continued to be militant. There are some groups more militant than others, but it was the sort of the birth of it, where we didn't just we didn't hide in secret. It wasn't the Mattachine Society, which was this name that hid who we were. It was the Gay Liberation Front. So what followed was about a decade of fight back that culminated with several struggles to acquire anti-discrimination laws. There was the struggle in California for gay teachers to be allowed, for gay people to allow to be teachers that would heavily involve Harvey Milk. There were other similar fights like this, but ultimately in the early 80s, things changed pretty significantly with the public awareness of AIDS. Obviously, the fight became much more focused at that point on fighting for health care and for research into AIDS and for better treatment of AIDS patients. And this gave rise to many, many organizations, one of the most famous of which is ACT UP, or the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power. And one of the impressive things about ACT UP is that they did not simply take it to the streets. They took it directly to the people who were responsible. They took it to Wall Street. They were one of, if not the only group to shut down the stock exchange. They went in there, they shut it down, and they did a banner drop and basically held the stock exchange hostage for a while. And they knew, because they had learned from the history of struggle, that there would be no news coverage if they didn't cover it themselves. So they brought in their own video equipment and made sure everybody knew about it. They took it to the FDA. They took it to every government agency that was relevant, and they made a difference. Them and all the other groups fighting for this, there were groups that had to fight to get women included in women were not diagnosed with AIDS. They were diagnosed with AIDS-related complex, so they had to fight to get women just to be recognized as it being possible that they even had AIDS, so they could get the appropriate treatment. They fought to keep drug prices down. They fought to make experimental drugs available sooner, and they fought against the public demonization that came with the AIDS epidemic. And it can't be ignored how racism also played a part in this. Many of the first people to be known to have AIDS were black, especially Haitian people, and they were also, they received the same treatment. They were demonized in the same way, whether or not they were straight or queer. And throughout all of these struggles, non-white people were always, more greatly affected, when it came to AIDS treatments or when it came to discrimination, whatever the fight was, and they were always involved in the more radical aspects of it. It was never just, it was never just, we could never fight for our liberation without including that in our fight. By the 90s, as the AIDS struggle obviously continued, but then different issues started to rise throughout the 90s. Well, throughout the history of capitalism, there's been violence against us. But the 90s, there became this greater awareness and greater organizing around it. And there was also the Defense of Marriage Act, which was a federal law which defined marriage as between a man and a woman. But the struggle also began by the late 90s, although there was still militant fight back, although there was still organizing, especially around the violence inspired by the violence against Matthew Shepard and Brandon Tina, most notably, but many, many, many others. There was still militant fight back, but there also began to be, as we saw with the Mattachine Society, a shift to a more conservative viewpoint where same-sex marriage became the focal point instead of the violence, or the answer to the violence was hate crimes laws instead of a deeper understanding of the source of this violence. They focused on putting more people into prison, which is hardly an answer to racist, homophobic, transphobic violence. By the early 2000s, under the extremely conservative administration of George Bush, though, we did have a major victory in that the Supreme Court, in response to massive support from the public and militant struggle of decades worth of militant struggle, ruled that the anti-sodomy laws were no longer constitutional, effectively legalizing homosexuality, which was, although that has been ruled and although that has been passed, there are still many places, including Louisiana, where they have anti-sodomy laws in the books. They are still enforced arbitrarily, and just because something is unconstitutional doesn't stop the state from doing it, and we don't, working class LGBTQ people especially don't have the resources to fight this in the courts. And certainly recently, there was an article in the Workers' Voice that you can find here somewhere, explaining that the court system, the civil court system, there's no resources for poor people to actually use those. It's not really an option. So, although that law was struck down, the effect of it there's still a fight there. that fight, by the mid-2000s, the movement had been very much co-opted by nonprofits like Human Rights Campaign and other organizations like that. It became more focused on the same-sex marriage struggle. There had been a struggle for the Employment Non-Discrimination Act around this time as well, which completely fell apart, especially after they chose to water it down. They threw trans people under the bus and said it would just be for queer people, and the end result of that was the collapse of the support for it and the end of the struggle for that law. Same-sex marriage did, of course, eventually get passed. It did eventually become legal, but many, especially working-class LGBTQ people, although we supported it because there are material gains to be had from same-sex marriage, there are so many more things that we need first, from healthcare and housing and educational access and job discrimination. And after same-sex marriage passed, the general sense in the broader movement was that we had won, that was all that there was to be fought for, and the movement became part of what we were fighting against. And that's also to say nothing of the fact that, as we pointed out earlier, the nuclear family is a product of capitalism. It's about controlling property, private property, and the inheritance of private property. It's about reinforcing and protecting capitalist society, class society. So fighting to be part of that, fighting for same-sex marriage, was in some ways just buying more into our own oppression. These days the movement is no longer the militant mass struggle that it once was. We still face enormous problems. We have had years of bathroom bills, years of the backlash against same-sex marriage, where businesses have fought for the right to deny us service, and which started with wedding cakes but has escalated to housing and healthcare. And of course, under the current administration, everything that we have wanted is being rolled back piece by piece by piece. Last year, they released a memo reinterpreting Title VII to no longer include protections for LGBTQ people. It effectively just legally erased trans people and opened the doors for everything that, all the news that came last week. The laws, the change in policy and laws that have led to them saying that LGBTQ people can be denied from homeless shelters, we can be discriminated in housing and jobs, there are no longer support from the Department of Education for LGBTQ students, especially not trans students. There are religious freedom laws, which are a smokescreen. It's not about religious freedom. It has never been about religion. It never will be about religion. It is about reinforcing capitalist society and private property. But they use this to divide the working class. They use this to pit us against one another, pit LGBTQ people against religious people, even though there's obviously overlap between the two. And so now our healthcare is threatened. Now they are trying to change the policy so that under Title IX, any trans person in any public bathroom is considered a threat, effectively barring us from using the restroom anywhere in public, which is incredibly dangerous. That is because it's a necessity. That nobody's going to. Eventually, somebody's going to have to use one of those restrooms, and then either they're going to be arrested or assaulted or worse. So it creates an atmosphere of backlash against us, of violence against us, and it encourages that division of the working class. And this is part of the reason why, but not the only reason why, we see the escalating number of murders of trans people every year. In the last month, I think it's been 3 or 4 black trans women been murdered, and it's last year was the highest year on record of known murders of trans people, mostly black and brown, mostly people of color, which is, of course, what I spoke of earlier, the way in which racism and the way in which white supremacy plays into this. It deeply, deeply connected, as Sasha pointed out. The indigenous people who lived here and many of the African nations that were enslaved by European colonizers respected and celebrated diversity of gender and sexuality. So this rise of white supremacy and capitalism, like that was also tied into LGBTQ oppression, because they wiped it out. They suppressed it completely, and that has continued to this day. It has never not been connected. So this year, as last year and last year as well, and previously other groups have done this, but New Orleans Pride has become everything capitalist. They have almost no political messaging whatsoever. They have corporate sponsorships. They have a police presence. In fact, last year they had a police float of LGBTQ police, and they also have a military presence. They have become part